Hi everyone, this is the video that goes with chapter 5, the chapter on physical and cognitive development in early childhood, so ages that 3 to 5-ish. As I said before, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on physical development, but I do want to point out from that section of the chapter the content on the myelin sheath, and that's the coating around the axon that speeds transmission of information passing from one neuron to another. So the process of myelination goes on through the end of adolescence, so until you're about 25 years old. So your thinking is getting faster and more complex. You're able to hold more things in working memory as you're able to make those kinds of connections in your brain. So physical development in the brain is going on for the first 25 years of your life, which is astonishing to think that we were born 25 years too early, but don't tell that to any of your pregnant friends. In the part on cognitive development, we start out talking about Piaget, and in the pre-operational stage, Piaget talks about operations, and it's how we operate on the environment to understand the environment. So the concept of an operation is being able to mentally reverse something, being able to understand that when something falls on the floor, it was sitting up on something before, it rolled to the edge, and then it fell on the floor, rather than, I don't know, it's on the floor and it used to not be on the floor. Being able to mentally reverse that task. Trying to remember, if you ask a child where they lost their jacket. Very young children will not be able to do this, but by the time they're around age 5, they can sort of mentally reverse their actions and say, okay, the last time I saw my jacket was when I was on the playground, and then did I have it when I came in from the playground, and did I have it in the classroom, and so on. I mean, I know grown-ups who aren't very good at this. You ask somebody, you tell somebody you lost your iPhone, and they go, well, where did you last have it? And it's like, well, if I knew that, I would know where it was. So those reversible mental actions are really important. Children are increasingly representing their world with words, with images, with pictures, and they start to think using symbols. So one of the ways that we know they use symbols is we ask them questions, and as soon as they can talk or look at something more reliably or for a longer period of time, and we start to understand how they are using symbols. So if you ask a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, if you give them a picture of an ink blot, and you say, this is a picture and it's, somebody worked really hard on it, then they might look at that ink blot and say, that looks like a bear to me. But if you say somebody spilled, if you give them the exact same picture, kids of the same age, and you say somebody spilled paint on it, what do you think it looks like? It's like, well, it looks like some paint. So they start to understand intentionality versus accidental kinds of things and how we can use those things to try and talk about it. Early symbol use, if you show a child a picture, a photograph of a shoe, very young children will try to put their foot in the shoe. They look at very realistic pictures of real objects, and they try to grasp it. They try and pick it up. So these are the very youngest children. And then as they get older and get more experience, they start to understand that there are pictures of things, and then there are actual things, and those are different. It isn't until they're around 3 years old that you can show them a picture of something and they could use that as a symbol or a map where they could go and find the actual thing. So it's a very interesting developmental period. Again, Piaget was really interested in the quote-unquote mistakes that children made, the way that they think differently than we think, and what that says about their thinking and how they are at a very different developmental stage than we are. Reading. If you're reading to a child at about 18 months of age, a child doesn't actually understand or doesn't care whether the book is upside down or right side up. Now, obviously they will if there's a picture, but if it's words on a page, that has no meaning to them. So a 3-year-old, if you show them a picture of ice cream and you say, well, how do you think that would feel? They would think that if you touched the picture, it would feel cold. But they know that it's not real ice cream, and yet they would still say that it would feel cold. So these are the kinds of things that they're really interested in. Blocks, you can show them a picture of blocks, and it's like, what would happen if I turned that picture upside down? And children will say the blocks would fall out. Or if you're watching something on TV and there's a bowl of popcorn, and like, what would happen if I turned the TV upside down? The popcorn would fall out. So there's that differentiation between what's real and what's a symbol for something. It takes several years for them to get there with us. Children's thinking is developing at this time. They have intuitive thought. They sort of they want to know the answers to questions, but their reasoning is not quite, not quite. It's not as developed as ours is. Thank goodness. Thank goodness that we're beyond that. They tend to center on one thing and fail to notice the other aspects of something. And so it's hard for them to understand the whole picture when they're just thinking about this one thing. So sometimes when a child will ask you about something, it's like, what are all those machines for? Like they would look at somebody's kitchen counter that might have a toaster and a coffee machine and maybe a mixer or a hot water kettle. They're like, what are all those machines for? And it's like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, why do you have them? Well, why do you have them is different than explaining to them what a toaster does and what a coffee maker does. And so sometimes they don't know how to formulate the question. That can also help sometimes. When they say, where do babies come from? You might want to have that conversation with them and you might not. And if you're in the might not category, you might ask the child, what do you mean? And they'll say, because they'll be pointing at a baby, and they'll say, well, where did their socks come from? And then you can say, they came from Target, and conversation over. But for us, when they say, where do babies come from? That's a much more complicated issue and answer. So we have to think about the question that they're asking, not what that question would mean if we were asking it. The book talks about various forms of pre-operational thinking. Egocentrism, again, they're not egocentric in the sense where if you said that somebody else was egocentric, you would say they only think about themselves. They're relatively selfish. Egocentrism in a pre-operational child just means they're not yet able to take the perspective of somebody else. And so if they see it, they assume that you can see it. And if they can't see it, they assume that you can't either. The conservation and water pouring task is well described, and you probably saw it in your developmental the developmental section of your introductory psychology as well. So pay attention to those things. Those are just examples of ways that children think differently than we are. They focus on or center on different aspects of a problem than we might. They assume that what they see is everything, and it's hard for them to reason abstractly about how something might have come to be. They just assume that it's all there. So the next topic in this chapter is Vygotsky, and Vygotsky is very influential in educational psychology. He thought that one of the best ways for children to learn and advance was through guided participation. So having people around them that could do things a little bit better than they could, or had more information than they do, so that they could guide them and help them to discover properties of things on their own. And so they learn from people. The children are learning from the people around them who are helping them, not giving them the answer, but sort of guiding them and sort of giving them some hints along the way. He thought that the zone of proximal development, that area where things are not too easy for you and they're not so hard that you can't do it, but they're in the middle where you could do it, but you need some help. And that's the zone of proximal development. And it's in that zone where you do your best learning because you can do some of it and then you get some information through guided participation from somebody else and you can do more. And then that becomes something that you know how to do. And so he thought that was one of the best ways to learn. He also thought that the people around, like a teacher, would provide scaffolding, hoping that the child would discover things. And you'll see this in the Montessori approach. They'll have a box or a tray of things that children can do things with and manipulate, and the hope is that they will discover the properties of those things and different uses for them. He thought that when it came to language, that their private speech was very important. So you might hear a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old talking to themselves while playing. They're playing quietly with some toys or something that interests them, or a package of pencils that they're making a story out of. Whatever it is that they're playing with, kids are very creative, but they will be talking out loud. And it's very interesting if you can eavesdrop to hear what they say. But they're narrating through, and Vygotsky thought that private speech was really important in helping them to organize their thoughts. Later in this semester, we'll talk about the power of narrative, but anytime you say something to somebody else, you write something, you make a full sentence out of that thing. So instead of ideas bouncing around in your head, you actually organized that. And so this is helping children organize their thoughts by saying them out loud in full sentences. So he thought that the role of private speech was really beneficial and really important. Um, it's also the case that children at this age will over imitate. So they will watch the people around them and they're not really sure what the relevant parts of the thing is that they're supposed to do. So they'll imitate all the parts of it and then see what sticks. And so you might get a preschooler coming home and saying, mommy line one, mommy line one. And it's like, they don't really know what a telephone line is. They don't have any idea why that was coming over the loudspeaker in their preschool. They just know that grown-ups do something different when that is announced. And so they're trying to figure it out. And by reenacting it and over imitating it, they're hoping that they will stumble on or somebody will help them to discover what the relevant parts of a situation are. Exuberance. So children overestimate their physical abilities, their memory abilities, their cognitive abilities. They think they are much more capable than they are. If you ask a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old how fast they can run, or if they can, if they could run a mile, or if they could do this, or if they could do that, most of them will say yes, and they will overestimate what they're able to do. And that's great, right? It's great because if they underestimate, it's like, oh no. You don't want a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old going, no, I don't think I could do that. Because if they don't try, they actually have no idea what their limits are. And if they don't try, they'll never get better. And so they overestimate. And that's actually a really adaptive quality in children. So when you hear them boasting about things, don't knock them down too swiftly, because it's good for them to think that they have this unrealistic, optimistic view of what it is that they can do. Your book talks about memory, and so I think autobiographical memory. It's unlikely that any of us remember anything before age, say 4 or 5. Some people do, very few, but everybody who does, everybody who thinks they remember something is completely convinced that they do. And so I'm not here to say whether you do or whether you don't, but it's mostly autobiographical memory in a continuous way. Doesn't exist before age 4 or 5. And even then, it can vary from child to child based on their circumstances. If you were in a military family and you moved every year or every other year, you didn't have as many reminders of things that you did. In other words, if you went to a new first grade, you never saw your old kindergarten again. You didn't see those people again. You didn't bump into them in the hallway. You didn't talk to them or see the building as you drove by. And so if those memories weren't cued a number of times, then those neural networks sort of faded away after a while. It doesn't mean that you couldn't ever recover or reinstate that memory, but it's exceedingly unlikely. And so people who have moved a lot tend to remember less from some of those, say, school experiences than people who stayed in the same school and had constant reminders and had constant remember when conversations over the course of their upbringing. Theory of mind. Children's theory of mind is what they think other people understand. And when a child achieves theory of mind, they understand that what you think and what they think can be different. So, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old may think that if they broke something or if they did something, they assume that you knew it too. And so they will blurt it out just right away. A 4 or 5-year-old understands that if you didn't see it and they didn't tell you and nobody else told you, you won't know what that thing is. And so that's where deception or lying is actually a sign of a cognitive advance and not sort of regressing to poor behavior. So when a child is doing that, they're testing it out. They're trying to understand what the limits are of your mind versus their mind and that understanding. So it takes a while for them to figure it out. I don't think anybody's going to teach their children to lie. That's not the point of it. But it is a sign of a cognitive advance when they start to do those things. Also, when you ask a child, it's like, did you break the cookie jar or did you do the thing? And they say no. If you ask them again, and this is important in a forensic situation, if you ask them again, they're very likely to change their answer. And early on, we thought that children could not be eyewitnesses in a defense, or they couldn't be an eyewitness on their own behalf. And what we found is that's not true. If you ask a child what happened, they will tell you what happened. But if you then ask them if you say, did this happen? And they say yes. And you ask them later, did this happen? And they say no. What's happening is not that they're not sure. It's likely that the first answer they gave you was the answer that they thought was correct or that they believe. But for a child, the only reason grown-ups ask a question twice is if you got it wrong the first time. So it's a response bias where if you say, well, did you see this thing happen? And then you ask them again, did you see this thing happen? Then they're going to change their answer because they must have gotten it wrong the first time. So we have to be very careful when we're talking to children and trying to ascertain what happened, especially if there's been a crime committed or there's an allegation of some sort, and they might be the only people who know the answer. It's very important to ask them in the correct way. And then when it comes to language development, phonology and morphology. Phonology is how things sound. Morphology is what things mean. So if you haven't heard in the first year of life, if you haven't heard the sounds of a language that doesn't, and if your native language doesn't have those sounds, it's unlikely that you will be able to discriminate them as an adult. So you can learn a language, but you won't speak it like a native speaker. So that's phonology. Morphology is meaning, how the units of meaning in language. And as children get older, their sentences get longer, they get more complex, they're acquiring many more words. They're acquiring new words every single day. It's just astonishing what they're learning. They're also learning new rules, and so they start to make mistakes that they didn't make before because they're learning a rule like if you could add ing to a verb, and so run becomes running and go becomes going, but there are certain words, there are irregular verbs in the English language. And so they start to make a mistake when they over-apply those rules. Sometimes they also underextend or overextend the meaning of something. If they initially think that all furry animals with four legs are a dog and they call everything a dog, then they have to learn that some of those are dogs, but some of them are cats or squirrels or other things. And so that process of learning language is complex. You do not have to teach language to children. Children will learn language, and I said this before when I was talking about experience expectant versus experience dependent. Language learning is experience expectant. All children will learn language. They will not learn to read, though. Reading has to be taught, and it has to be taught in a very particular way. So they're acquiring words. The average 18-month-old child might have 50 words, and they're getting 2 new words every hour. I mean, it's just astonishing. So they're learning that everything's got a name, and they want to know what that name is. So, but it's really complicated, right? Because if they want to learn a new word for things. So some of the time what they'll do is they'll say the wrong word, and then you will correct them and say the right word, and then they have the right word. And so that's a win for them. Sometimes you'll point at something and you'll say, that's an octopus. And it was like, what is it that she's pointing at? Is she pointing at the whole aquarium tank? Is she pointing at the plants that might be in the aquarium? What about the fish that just went by? And so they have to figure out what you're pointing at. And so, they hear octopus and they're looking at what you're pointing at, and they're trying to figure out what's the thing. And does octopus mean one of the tentacles, or does it mean the whole thing? I don't know why I picked octopus. So that's a hard one, but and they also have to figure out where the words stop and start. If you've ever listened to something in a foreign language or listened to a song where they were singing very quickly, even in your native language, sometimes it can be hard to figure out what the words are because you can't figure out where the spacing is between words. So if you say to a child, do you like lobster? Is it do you lie clobster, or do you like lobster? I don't know any babies that like lobster, but maybe they do. I don't know. I don't have a lobster opinion on children. But they're trying to map these things on, and they're very clever about it, but they're thinking so hard. They're using so many of their calories just processing their brain, and they're making all kinds of mistakes. But those are good things because people will correct them. If they point to something and they say octopus and somebody says, nope, that's a snail, now they've got another word, snail. And so now they can differentiate between octopus and snail. So spend plenty of time at the aquarium and they'll learn lots of new words. They tend to learn the words that they hear the most often, things that are interesting to them, and things that are meaningful. And so giving them the opportunity to have these conversations is extraordinarily important. What's not important at this age is a preschool that focuses on teacher-directed learning. It really should be children discovering things for themselves and doing the things that interest them. There's plenty of time later to do the rest of it. So books can be helpful, but children don't necessarily need to learn to read early. And learning to read early isn't always an advantage later on. It's not necessarily a disadvantage, but many people think that, oh, if you read better as a college student, you'd get more done. That's absolutely true. So if you learn to read earlier, maybe you would read better sooner, and that's not necessarily true. By about third grade, it's very difficult to tell the difference between children who were early readers and children who were not. And third grade is still pretty early in their there are some kids that are precocious, no question about that. But for most children, there's no need to learn to read sooner than it seems apparent. The way to learn to read is to learn to sound out the sounds, learning that letters make a sound and that they make different sounds and how you can put those together. That's critical. And so there used to be a question. I thought the question was answered 20 years ago. When I was in graduate school, we already knew the answer in psychology. The best way to teach kids to learn to read, to make them an independent reader, is to teach them the sounds of the letters and how to sound things out. That will turn them into an independent reader, so that when they get to a new word like cephalocaudal, they can sort of parse it out. They can pronounce it. They might be able to see parts within that they recognize. I don't know that cephalocaudal is the best example there, but I don't have a great example right now, but being able to decode the language using the sounds is much better than trying to recognize whole words. Because if you try to recognize and memorize whole words, then you've got a lot of work to do in memorizing all of those. And there used to be a teaching curriculum that asked children to do that. And then they moved on and they called it balanced literacy, where they did some phonics and some just recognizing words. Both of those are associated with much poorer reading, not only as a child, but as an adult. So if you cued reading, where they asked kids to guess based on the context of what the story was, what that word might be, and then look at the first letter, and if it starts with a C, might it be car, might it be cough, might it be, clamp, that guessing game, children that learn that, they never do as well as the other children. So it's a very inferior way to learn reading, and it's associated with people who have not learned to read well even as adults. So the phonics, or the code-based approach, is the one way to really teach reading, and the whole language approach, not at all. You'll see that on some test questions because I think it's really important. You may have children of your own, you may be influencing children, or you may just be having discussions about reading, how you learn to read and how others learn to read. And it's really important to know that there is a lot of research, a tremendous amount of research, and there really is no question about the best way to teach reading. If you've got questions about that, let me know. Takeaway message. There's a quote that I have from Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and her colleagues, and it goes, "If it has no clear benefit to the child's development, and if it may hinder development, there may be no defensible reason to encourage the introduction of formal academic instruction and adult-focused learning during the preschool years." And what she means there is we do not need learning centers or academically based preschools. What we need is opportunities for children to play and discover things and discover the properties of things, and do those kinds of things. And there'll be plenty of time later for the other things, but you don't want to start changing around the sequence of things, because it's no help, and it wastes their time. So, okay. That's it for this chapter. Let me know if you've got any questions, and see you in the next one. Bye.